us for today's webinar, Fast Track Leadership Succession Planning, a new toolkit. Our presenters today are Michael D'Souza, who is a Senior Consultant and Project Manager at CPS HR Consulting, Karen Evans, the Training Manager at CPS HR, and Jeff Burkaw, a Senior Consultant at CPS HR. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few pieces of information about the webinar. To avoid interruptions to the presentation, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You can still ask questions using the Q&A panel in your webinar dashboard, though. We'll make every effort to address your questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website and as a handout in your webinar dashboard. We'll also forward a link to all of today's attendees once the recording is available for viewing. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Michael, Karen, and Jeff.
Thank you, Julie. We're really glad to be here today on Thanksgiving Eve, and we appreciate the attendance of folks out there. Our focus today is on leadership succession planning in the public sector, something that is generally acknowledged that it's really, really important, but in many cases is not getting accomplished. It's not getting traction the way it should. We'll talk about some alternatives to the very big challenges of trying to figure out who in your organization may have leadership potential that can be enhanced and developed, and then figuring out the areas where they may have some deficiencies or some skills gaps, closing that gap. And we'll be talking about a new toolkit that we think can meet some of these needs of identifying potential and then meeting it with skills. There will be some questions at the end of the presentation today. And as a little added bonus for your indulgence being here before Thanksgiving, we will interject a few Thanksgiving trivia bits that will make you the hit of the party on your gatherings tomorrow. And the first one will be, and this is for you to use tomorrow when you go somewhere, which U.S. state is the biggest consumer of turkey? And the answer is the state of Minnesota, which happens to be the largest producer of turkeys in the U.S., producing about 50 million. Stand by for some more of these. Closing the gap on succession planning. According to a recent report from a consulting group called the Mejorando Group, only about 13% of local government managers are 40, and then by extension, a much larger number are much older than that. This is the silver tsunami that we've heard so much about for about 15 years, and only now is perhaps actually coming true. This year, a little less than a third of government workforce reaches 61, the average retirement age, and again, a much higher percentage of leadership is at a higher relative age. This year is unique because it's the year in which millennials basically technically outnumber baby boomers in the workplace, adding to the interesting kind of complexity of that workplace. And local governments are now reporting accelerated retirement rates. These were somewhat diminished during the effect of the economic meltdown of about 10 years ago. So for the first 5 to 7 years, retirements went way down in public sector, but they're back up to speed and they're accelerating. So the silver tsunami is starting to hit the shore. Want to define terms here a little bit because there can be a confusion between a couple of terms we'll use today. It's the kind of subtle difference between workforce planning versus succession planning. And certainly they're in the same family, they're in the same stream of organizational improvement activity. They're sometimes used interchangeably, but we'd like to say that for our purposes, workforce planning is the broad notion of basically talent continuity for the big streams of workers within your organization. Whereas the distinction with succession planning, it tends to deal with a subset of especially critical positions in the organization and trying to provide both talent continuity and the retention of knowledge, organizational knowledge, as those folks sometimes leave the organization. Usually the criticality is determined by some level of position in the organization, such as a band of management up and above, but sometimes it has to do with essential technical positions. An example would be if you have a kind of a legacy enterprise or computer system, and you have that one senior IT person whose office is down in the basement who knows how it works, that person may be a candidate for succession planning because their loss would have a critical risk management impact on your organization. So we're talking about specifically succession planning today. Succession planning, as we see it within CPS HR, as a firm that works in this area, is really part of the system approach to talent management itself, and it is a very important part. And as we'll say today, it's one that's been very difficult to kind of get traction in, to get results in, even though most of knowledge is important and increasingly important given some of the demographic changes going on in our society and in our workplaces. Most succession planning models, and there's no one right model, there's models tend to have certain components. They have a step in which you have to identify from a risk management standpoint, the critical positions in your organization that if lost or if the seat is unfilled is going to cause difficulties to the organization. You have to select participants in the program, and this is usually some kind of assessment or qualification process. This can often be very time consuming, uses a lot of resources in the organization, especially the time and energy of your leadership team. It has a preparation stage in which you will tend to analyze and assess the different potential candidates in the program to determine their as-is current state of competencies and try to identify any areas in which they have shortfalls or gaps to help them close those gaps. And then step 4, of course, is to provide different applied learning and development activities to kind of close the gap and add skills for those persons. And again, this can take a lot of time and resources to find the right learning event or program or situation to remediate that. And then finally, the ongoing tracking of the program, making adjustments, celebrating achievements, and getting people closer to the ability to basically fill those roles. The state of public sector succession planning, in generally, you can say that everybody says it's really important, but it isn't happening at the rate that it needs to happen, especially so in recent years. The usual suspects, the most frequent explanation why it isn't happening or isn't happening to the degree that it needs to tend to be that a lot of organizations feel they just don't have the internal expertise to do this. They're concerned that they may wade into so-called pre-selection, which is tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, you're going to have the job when I retire, which of course is inappropriate to civil service standards. You can't do that, so they're concerned about that. Sometimes there is not genuinely the leadership commitment that you have to have, and that leadership commitment can include both resources, both dollars and time, not just to initiate a program, but actually to keep it going and sustain it. Operational demands don't allow time for folks to really participate in a program. The demands on a lot of leaders or potential leaders in the public sector, which is generally being asked to do a lot more with less. Leaders don't have the extra time for all the extra activities, so you have to find efficiencies to achieve this. And simply a lack of awareness about, well, once I identify a gap with someone, identify an area where they need to add skills and competencies, how do I achieve it? What are the programs or curriculums or learning situations available that I can pick that would be a better fit to help that person grow in the area needed? And then finally, one of the other kind of complaints is that, gee, it sure would be nice if we had some system tools, some computerized tools that might automate some of these activities, again, to achieve an efficiency, because we just don't have the time to do a lot of manual support for these things. An interesting factor is also that the market for leadership talent has changed somewhat. The public sector did benefit for the early years of the economic showdown of actually luring some very talented leaders from the private sector into public sector, and that was a good thing for both sides. But increasingly, that appears not to be the case. You really have now with the good news and bad news of the current period in American history is we have the lowest unemployment rate in 40 years, and that applies especially to highly talented individuals and highly talented leaders and senior leaders. There's a decreasing public sector ability to compete with the private sector, and you even see more situations where among public sector, some subsegments, local government, for example, is more successful kind of luring away talent from some of the bigger public agencies. So it is definitely a tough time to be in that business. Okay. A second quick trivia item for you. Basically, the question is, where in the world did pumpkins first exist, and were they raised? Well, pumpkin is a squash, and they are thought to have originated in North America. The oldest evidence of pumpkins are pumpkin seeds dating between 5,000 and 7,000 years BC in Mexico. Okay, we're coming to our first poll question. We're very curious to know which of the responses provided in the poll best explain the state of leadership succession planning in your agency or organization. We're interested to hear your input on that.
Okay, so the poll is open. I'm seeing some responses already come in. Please go ahead and make your selection, and we will share results as soon as all responses are in. It looks like they're coming in pretty quickly, so we'll have maybe another 5 to 10 seconds before we close it up and share the results. And I'm seeing a pretty clear winner on here so far. Anybody care to venture a guess? Here, looking doesn't count.
I'm guessing we want to develop a plan but don't know how to start.
We will reveal that in a moment.
I can't see her screen.
Okay.
So I can.
Oh.
Okay, it looks like we've got everything in, so let's go ahead and close up the poll and share the results. And oh my, yes. Actually, Jeff, you were right. We want to develop a plan, but not sure how to start. We led the pack with 38% of the responses.
Wow.
The next one was we are working to develop a plan now. That had 28%. Next step was we have a formal plan in place that is guiding actions. That was 18%. 14% said they just don't know. And bringing up the tail end of it was we had a plan in the past, but it is not guiding actions now, and we had only 2% of respondents select that. So let's go back to...
It sounds fairly representative of our topic, and certainly I'd say for a lot of folks out there, we're in the right place today to be talking about this topic, given this response.
So there we go. Back to the slide deck.
Okay, are we on the, there we are. All right, thanks. I'm Jeff, everybody. Thanks, Mike. So Mike was just talking about the succession planning process, and that first step is identifying those key roles, the key positions in your organization. That next step is actually selecting the participants for the succession planning process, whether it's going into a leadership training and development program or just sort of a pipeline into those leadership positions. There are all sorts of methods that have been used, traditionally, like just, people express interest. They want to be, included in the leadership succession planning process. Typically, employment history and job performance is looked at. Obviously you want people who are the high performers in your organization, you want to develop those people. Sometimes there's what I call an automatic succession from lower positions, everybody who is a director used to be an assistant director, and it's no coincidence, it just sort of happens, it's just kind of automatic. But a lot of organizations do try to do something a little bit more rigorous, or at least an attempt at a little more rigorous process. One of them is something called the 9-box, and this is one of the most common processes. So I just wanted to share that with you a little bit. You may have seen this. This is a typical 9-box, and obviously it's called a 9-box because there are 9 boxes within a larger box. What you're doing with this is you're assessing people on a couple of different dimensions. One is typically job performance. So you're looking at individuals' job performance within the organization, and if they're the top performers. And then there's usually some other dimension that they're rated on, and it's often just called potential, or sometimes it's called readiness. It's not very clear. It usually ends up being sort of a likability, or people who are just sort of the chosen ones. We'll talk about this in a second. But first of all, I want to talk about this performance measure. First of all, yeah, we definitely want people who are the top performers. We want people who have done well in their job and have served the organization well. But I ask you, does past or even current job performance necessarily predict success in a future leadership role? And I would say no, not necessarily. I think that people could be absolutely stellar in their job, but just wouldn't make a good leader. I think, and I've known people like this who they're great in their job, they just should never be in a leadership role for various reasons, and it's not necessarily bad. Leadership is a very different thing. So I'm not so sure. I mean, definitely we want the people who have performed well, but I don't think there's necessarily a direct correlation between past job performance or even current job performance and success in that what might be a very different role for them. And this other dimension that's often just called potential, it's really not clear. And I've looked at lots of different processes that have been used by lots of different organizations, and it's never really well defined exactly what potential is. And I think it's really problematic to have potential as one of your measures on something like this, when what we're trying to do is essentially predict potential, in the end. And so we're using potential as one of the measures to predict potential, and it's kind of a circular reasoning. So we should look at exactly what leadership potential is. Well, leadership potential really it's a capacity to be successful in a future role, right? So it's not right now, but it's to be successful in a future leadership role over time. So given some time, and during that time, there will be some sort of learning and development going on in the individual. So we can break down this potential for future success in a couple of different ways. And we get at it by two things. First of all, there's motivation to be in a leadership role. So someone could possess all the leadership competencies in the world and look great, say, on paper, so to speak. But if they aren't motivated, if they don't really want to be in a leadership role, they're not going to be successful. But then people should also, they can't just be motivated, they can't just want to be president or whatever it is. If they don't have, certain competencies, they're not going to be successful. And so, now we're talking about the future. We're talking about success in a future leadership role. So we're not talking about competencies right now necessarily. People don't have to have all of the competencies to be a leader, but they have to possess a certain amount of certain core leadership competencies. So they should be demonstrating those behaviors now to show that they have this capacity for future success. So I want to talk about this motivation factor first. There are a couple ways to get at this. One is, you can look at it in terms of personality, like conscientiousness or achievement motivation or something like that. But, personality measures there's self-report measures, and so there are issues with that. We prefer a more behavioral approach where you can actually observe people, exhibiting certain behaviors or not exhibiting certain behaviors that show that they have motivation. Like, have they shown a willingness to take on extra duties and responsibilities above and beyond their core job, that indicate that they're willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of the organization. And it all comes down to a willingness to embrace a certain amount of psychological discomfort. In other words, getting out of their comfort zone. They say we're at our best when things are at their worst. We only grow when we are stretched to our limits. So the key here is, has the person done those things on their own to stretch themselves and to grow themselves? So assessing motivation is a great thing to do as a first step. If someone's not motivated to be in a leadership role, there's no point in continuing to assess them any further. So if you do assess this, you can be in a written narrative form. You can have people write up, essentially an essay, or you can do an interview, where you're just looking for evidence of, organizational contributions, things that are outside of their current core job, contributions in previous jobs for other organizations, if they've undertaken any kind of training or development opportunities, or gotten, certifications or gone through mentoring programs. And the key here is if they've done that on their own, if they've gone out and taken the initiative to get this additional training and to better themselves, all of these things lead to leadership motivation. And then the other aspect is those core competencies. So we've identified 7 competencies, and this is based on looking at many different leadership competencies and what's common across all of them. And we have determined that we think there are 7 core competencies that people must be displaying at least to a certain extent right now in order to be successful after a certain amount of leadership development. And there are 7 of them. I won't spend a whole lot of time on them, but just real basically, the first one is accountability, and this is all about integrity and trustworthiness. So can we trust the individual? The second one is learning orientation. This is an intellectual curiosity. We want people who have a desire to always learn, to keep learning new things and applying that knowledge. Number 3, of course, is good old perseverance, persisting in the face of obstacles and setbacks and being adaptable and flexible. And then vision and strategic action. Now, you've probably seen this as, vision and strategic orientation or something like that. We call it action because we're not so interested in knowing if a person is, believes in the goals of the organization so much as making sure that their behaviors are in alignment with the vision, the values, and the goals of the organization. The next one is what we call inspire. So do they create a sense of direction and purpose in others? And the next one is fosters collaboration. So this isn't just collaboration and teamwork and being able to work well with others. This is actually developing it in other people, so fostering that among other people. So a lot of these, you'll see a lot of these core competencies are really other-oriented. They're very social, I guess you could say. And then finally, facilitates understanding. So this goes beyond the typical communication, being a good communicator, to really an emphasis on making sure that other people understand, the understanding of others. So you can assess these in lots of different ways. We like to use a 360-degree survey. As you probably know, 360-degree survey is where you're getting some kind of ratings from all around, hence the 360 degrees, all around the individual. So there can be self-ratings, but also you have supervisor ratings, peer ratings, subordinate ratings, and you can get a big picture of the individual. So our survey that we've got about 5 to 7 behavioral indicators for each competency. So a behavioral indicator is it's an on-the-job behavior that demonstrates that a person has a certain amount of that particular competency. So we present all of those in the form of a question. And then we ask, how often does this person demonstrate this behavior? And then they can rate that from almost never up to almost always. So this is just one page from our survey. I know the print's kind of small, but I wanted you to kind of see what the whole thing looks like. So for example, we'll show competency, perseverance. There's the description of the competency right under it, and then you can see under that we've got 6 different behavioral indicators, like remains focused in the face of setbacks and obstacles, and then how often does the person exhibit that, and then they go through that. So again, about 5 to 7 behavioral indicators for each one of the 7 competencies, and then again rated in a 360-degree format. So we get peer ratings and supervisor ratings and subordinate ratings and all of that. So the results that we get from this assessment, we can do 2 things with it, really. We can, first of all, we can use the scores to select those candidates for participation in a leadership development program. So from this example on the right, you can see, their scores for each competency, and then you can do some kind of an average or something and come up with a overall score, 3.96 leadership potential overall score, and then you can use scores to to select individuals based on whatever criteria you set, and then also add in that that motivation factor. But also maybe more importantly and certainly more interestingly, I think, you can look at the individual rating results and you can identify areas for development for the person. So that this is that closing the gaps, closing those skill gaps to help the person get more ready for those leadership roles. So you can see from this results example, we've got each of those behavioral indicators under the perseverance competency, and we've got self ratings, we've got ratings from other people, and there's a gap rating which shows the difference between how a person sees themselves and how other people see them. We can look for areas that are a little bit lower than others. Now, this example, the person scored rather high, but we can look for those ones that are a little bit lower, like remains focused in the face of setbacks and obstacles, or increases effort when needed to get the job done. Those a little bit lower. Those could be areas where the person might need to develop. So based on that, those all of these results, we can again select people to go into the process or programs, and we can develop a program, a development program for those individuals so that they will be more ready to go into those key leadership roles given a certain amount of time.
Okay. Before we move on to our next poll, continuing our theme of Thanksgiving trivia to make you the head of the gathering tomorrow, the question is, how big was the largest turkey on record? And the answer is 86 pounds. Wow. Turkey in England. And I would have to say that if I saw that in a dark alley, I would be terrified. So I'm glad it's over there. I'm not here. Okay. Well, now we're going to move on to our next poll question. And this question is particularly on the resources. What resources are available to you and your organization that would help would-be leadership candidates learn competencies? And learning resources can take a lot of different forms. The poll will be coming up now.
Okay, the poll is open and responses are coming in. So, select all the applies on this, and y'all are very quick on responding to this. We're getting responses pouring in very quickly. So, we'll close it up just shortly, but please consider each response carefully. Select all that apply on this one. These responses are a little closer. Good. A little closer than they were. So, like, if we're just winding down now, let's go ahead and close the poll and see how that came in. Okay. Jeff, do you want to share this?
Sure. Okay. So for the first one, internal training or trainers to do, and/or leadership academy event, 64%. That's wow. That's high. That's great. That is great. Yeah. So a bit lower, though, only 36% for learning management systems with the resource library. And 39% partnering with training providers. So we've got some outside resources to help out. And then 66% access to online training resources. And that's great because there are a lot of resources out there. So making them available to your employees is certainly a great thing. And then 39% doing actual mentoring and job rotation and stretch assignments. Good for, that's always good for, not just for leadership, but just for the whole organization.
Yeah, it's really nice to see, and Karen is the expert here today, that basically nothing against the traditional classroom-led instructor training. That's an important potential resource, but to understand all the other options that we have now that we maybe didn't have as readily 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's the slide deck. Great.
Well, great. Good morning, everyone. This is Karen Evans, and thank you again for joining. We're really excited to be able to talk to you about this particular program and the assessment tool. And this part of the package as well is sort of a library of resources. And it's great to see from your results how broad and diverse your leadership training, professional development, growth opportunities for your team are. as we talked about early, one of the hardest things sometimes is, knowing what's available, credible, curated resources.
Nothing, I'm looking at a question or something in my screen.
Well, do share, please.
I actually cannot. I can tell you, someone said if they saw a turkey that large, they would run.
I'm with them.
Yes.
All comments welcome.
No, all comments welcome.
I would run and get cranberries off.
Yes. So we've got your assessment results, or we've got a body of results from a group of folks who have taken the assessment. Now, what do you do with that, and how do you know where to start? So what CPS did was we developed a database, essentially, a learning resources library. It's a curated body of resources that will map back to each one of the leadership potential competencies and the behavioral indicators. So it's a place to start with down a learning and development path, and focuses on not only working on the development of working on opportunities where you have room for development and stretching yourself, but also strengthening in those areas that are sort of superpowers for you, so you can use those strengths to maybe bridge the gap, some of the other gaps. It's a very broad and diverse body of resources, and it's very it's a continually growing list, so it's not set in stone, and it continues to evolve, where we continue to review and add additional resources and draw on our senior leadership or our experts who have been in roles of senior leadership roles within the public and private sectors. So what's in the library? In the library, you'll see books and articles, not full books and articles, but recommended readings from books and articles. You'll see podcasts, videos. There'll be examples of training courses, as well as on-the-job assignments, stretch assignments on the job, and also many tools and templates to help you get started. So here's just a sample of what a report would look like, building on a strength. And this one happens to be around facilitating understanding and fostering collaboration and inspiring. So you can see we've got a reading, we have a video, there's a stretch assignment where you can go out and gain a lost customer, and a potential course to take. And then this one is an area to develop, and this is really around perseverance. These resources tie back directly to the competencies and the sort of descriptors related to the competency of perseverance. You can see again, it's fairly broad. We have a reading, a video, resources, and these are just examples. So, can you go back one for me, Mike? Thank you. So you've got your reports, and you have a list of all the things tied back to each one of your areas that you can work on. But what do you do with that now? How do you get started? How do you keep track? And a great way to do that is with what's called an action learning plan. It's a great way for you to track your progress. If you have a coach or a mentor that you're working with, it's a great way to work with them around what that plan is. It's a great tool for having one-on-ones with your manager or your supervisor so they know what you're working on. It's just a great tracking tool for you as you get started down your pathway. So we had a sample, but it does not seem to be coming up for us. So we'll provide that at the end of the presentation. We can send that document. It's just a sample coaching plan. It's a template, and it basically is what are you going to do, who you're going to do it with, what's your timeline, and what's your follow-up, and what competencies does it tie back to? So just to summarize, the library is individualized, it's personalized for you based on your areas of strength and the areas for improvement for those development opportunities. It really is your starting place for working on a learning and development plan. It takes some of that initial guesswork out of ensuring you've got those high quality curated resources. And it's really designed to fit you and your time, anytime, anywhere. You'll see there's a lot of different kinds of ways to engage in professional development, and very flexible to fit your learning style as well as your time. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, so you see so far we've in talking about the in some cases very significant resource issues and doing things like determining for potential for candidates for leadership succession planning, where they're at now, what is their, as we've been saying, kind of potential to kind of grow into the role, as well as, again, the resource demands of once you go through a process of determining you have some individuals who appear to be qualified and should be invested in to basically grow and learn. Again, the time it can take to basically go research and compile and make judgments about the viability of certain learning activities and programs, it's very time and energy, and sometimes in a dollar sense, very demanding. What we've attempted to talk about in the new toolkit is the way that we think you can basically achieve a lot of these objectives using much more reduced time and resource requirements. And these are things like the toolkit can be applied either organization-wide as an alternative to other approaches, or can even be applied in a pilot sense for an organization if you're the type of organization that likes to kind of do a test of something before spreading it out more broadly than that. We wouldn't want to say, even with the greater efficiencies of this toolkit, there still are the standard requirements of almost all both workforce and succession planning that basically say you have to have still very clear and transparent communication and outreach activities to make sure folks are understandably aware of the opportunities. You have to have sustained executive support, and beyond just positive statements, positive verbal statements about the importance of succession planning, the leadership needs to take other actions as well. And there has to be the commitment to learning that can be applied to real work challenges, because the essence of a lot of the learning activity for succession planning is not just as a, if you will, an academic exercise, but it's an attempt to basically bring back skills and competencies that can be applied to the work for the benefit of the career of the individual, of course, but more importantly, for the overall organizational performance of the public agency, because that's the purpose of succession planning, is really about sustaining the leadership being applied to help organizational performance meet the mission of the organization. And Jeff's going to say a few words about some of to kind of summarize some of the key features of this toolkit.
So again, I want to stress that we're not assessing people's ability to go into a leadership role right now. We're really talking about potential. We're looking off into the future. And so given a certain amount of time, given a certain amount of development, and then development guided by, the results of this assessment. So, it's a lot more efficient. It's more, I think, effective than any of these, traditional approaches, which haven't been particularly objective. And that's another key point, is that this process is very objective, because we're using those behavioral indicators. So is the person actually demonstrating those behaviors on the job? If the person is not, as indicated by the ratings from, peers and supervisors and subordinates, then the person just isn't displaying those competencies, so they don't necessarily have them. And not to criticize any of the other methods out there, there are a lot of other, other ways of going about assessing potential. A lot of them are self-report personality type measures, perhaps very good, but we really like the objectivity of using those behavioral indicators. Is the person actually doing these particular behaviors, displaying these behaviors on the job? And then, of course, I mentioned the results of the assessment can show you where those gaps are. So it can show you exactly what a person needs to do or what you need to do to close those gaps. And like Karen was saying, not just for the the overall competency, but those individual behavioral indicators. We've got those different learning opportunities tied to individual behavioral indicators within the competency. So you can kind of drill down to a much lower level. And then, of course, the Learning Resource Library is, a great resource to, supplement all other activities. And we're not saying that it's, all the person has to do is go through and read these, read these articles and watch these videos and whatever. This is really a jump start. This is to get people started on the right track so they know what to work on, what to follow through on, so that over time, given, it'll take work. They have to be, they have to dedicate themselves to this, but over time they will be much more ready to go into those leadership roles.
Thank you, Jeff. Before we go into questions, I want to throw out another Thanksgiving trivia item for you. If you were impressed with the size of the largest turkey, you may be impressed with the next example. The size of the largest pumpkin. Some of you may come from areas where you're familiar at county fairs of the giant pumpkin competitions. The record for the largest pumpkin is 2,323.7 pounds.
Wait, what was it again?
3,323.7 pounds.
I am so ready for Thanksgiving now.
We're going to need a lot more whipped cream. But
a lot more whipped cream, a lot more. And I have one remaining one I'll do in just a minute, but we'll dive into some questions first. We're going to try to address some of the questions that are in the queue already, and I'll take the first one. It's a really good question. The question is, it's difficult to imagine succession planning in a government agency. What does it look like for public employers? Really good question, since you might immediately kind of associate, well, there's stuff I think you do in succession planning. You can't do that in the public sector. And if you're associating that with maybe what have been some practices in private sector historically, and still somewhat today, where basically individuals are identified as the stars, or they call them the hypos, the high potential employees. They're tapped on the shoulder and told that the CEO is going to be leaving in a couple of years, and these one or two people are going to be, groomed, and one of those people is going to get the job. In that sense, this questionnaire is very, very accurate. You can't do that in public sector. It's a violation of all sorts of civil service rules. But the difference is, to a large degree, that succession planning in the public sector basically says, I can't tap anyone on the shoulder. That wouldn't be appropriate. But I can determine from some folks meeting some minimum qualifications a pool, sometimes called a cohort, of folks who all of which can have opportunities to grow and learn, to compete for eventually, if they choose to, when that seat becomes open. That's the big difference between succession planning in public and private. You have to be very careful to communicate clearly this is not pre-selection. We're not guaranteeing that any one of these 5 people is going to get the job, because there will be a fair and open competition for that eventually. But it increases the probability that someone internal can be highly qualified for that, and greatly aids the ability of the organization to retain organizational knowledge. So good question.
Yeah, I just would like to add to that. We're not saying too that if people go through this development process, they should be automatically placed in those key roles, but they will be prepared to compete in an open and competitive process for those roles. You still have to have an open and competitive process, because we have our merit principle number 1 that we follow.
Okay. We'll go to the next question.
Okay, next question that came in is, how does an organization ensure a successful first year of a succession plan program? Jeff, you want to take that one?
So Karen, were you ready to?
Karen?
I would say that, don't try to do too much at once. Don't try to take on the whole thing. Don't try to, select or ready people for all of the positions at the top of your organization. Try it smaller scale, and learn as you go. Try it little bits, and then follow through. Don't just set people on their way and then hope it's working, and then 5 years from now expect people to be ready. Make sure you follow up with people, watch their progress, see how it's going. Again, just don't try to take on too much at once. Start slowly.
Yeah, if I can jump in, it's not unusual for some organizations to start smaller because of still even the resource demands of kind of an accelerated or faster track version. That they'll do a pilot within certain agencies. They'll learn from that, and then if it works out for them, then they'll decide to let it grow into the future. That's better than to start gargantuan, fail notably, and then everyone loses the steam and the impetus to try this again into the future.
Or they lose faith in the people who are running it. So,
Okay, here's another question. How do you do succession planning without staff feeling that you've selected the favorite employees?
I'll take that one.
Thanks, Karen.
Sure. So this is tricky, right? You want to have that. You want to have a pool. You want it to be a competitive process. You want to be transparent and follow those guidelines. I think that the most important thing is, and Mike spoke about this, is having that pool of qualified candidates and the transparency of how, what are the qualifications, how are you selected into that pool. And so it's an open and competitive process with very clear guidelines for evaluating each one of the candidates against the critical positions that you're filling.
Okay, that's a great answer. Thank you. So here's another question that has come in, and that is, what would you say is the most important aspect of succession planning?
Well, I think the most important aspect is this whole idea of learning and development, the idea that people don't have to be ready now, but they can be given learning. And so you send a message that, learning is important and that we value that. We're willing to, the organization is willing to provide the resources for that. Establish really a learning orientation or learning culture within your organization. Because that's what it is. This is about development and people bettering themselves, not just selecting people who are already at the top of the organization. So it's about allowing everybody the opportunity to develop themselves so they have a chance to move into leadership roles.
It's not unusual when you even have a pilot succession planning. This is going on with a client of ours right now, where they're off to a really good start with their succession planning pilot. But now they're getting more interest from non-management or non-would-be leaders who are basically saying, well, I see you're doing this stuff for leadership development. That's really cool. But what about us? Us who are maybe we don't aspire to the leadership. What about the investment, the developmental investment in us as senior staff and folks who maybe don't want to go to leadership development, but we'd like to think that we have the capacity to kind of grow and learn as well. So it creates in a kind of an interesting and sometimes positive way, that kind of pressure that you need to have a broader employee development focus across the board, understanding that it's at a different and more focused level for the leadership track. Okay.
Here's one. How would you measure the success of your succession plan program?
I'll take this one. There's usually a couple of key metrics. One, which is maybe fairly obvious, but it is very important, is one of the ways that you know that this is working is when you do have competitive positions for leadership into the future. Are they being filled by internal or external candidates? So your key metric is the higher numbers for qualified internal is a measure of that. But it isn't the only and most important one. What we hear sometimes is people ask the question, well, okay, so you have a competitive leadership position. One of the folks in the succession planning group or the cohort, they did get selected, yay. But what about for the other 3-4 people who were in that pool? Does that mean that was like wasted energy because they you didn't get selected, and the answer is a great big no. That you also can be measuring in the different applied learning or project activities or other folks in that pool engaged in, what were the outcomes or successes or ROI of their activities. That even when people aren't selected, you often will find that they will have been, of course, more productive, more knowledgeable, and more highly engaged employees during that period as well. And that's another metric you can measure to determine kind of the impact of the program.
Yeah, and if you look at these 7 core competencies, these aren't things that are only needed for those top leaders. Really, if you look at them, they're things that would help anyone at any level of the organization. So any development anybody does, like Mike said, is not wasted at all.
We have time for a few more questions, which is good. But so folks don't miss it, I want to give you the killer Thanksgiving trivia item. All right, and this will make you a star, and folks will be dumbfounded when they hear this. Okay. Okay. What is the proper name for a group of turkeys? We all know for different animals you have a pride of lions or a murder of crows. You have different terms for groupings of different animals. What is the proper name for a group of turkeys?
Not a gaggle. It would be geese, right?
Yeah. Well, the answer is it is not a gobble of turkeys, nor is it a flock of turkeys. It is a rafter of turkeys, R-A-F-T-E-R. The proper technical name for a group of turkeys is a rafter of turkeys.
Did not know that.
So make a bet with Uncle Joe tomorrow at the Thanksgiving gathering. That was our last trivia item. We hope you enjoyed it.
We did have someone suggest that would be a beast.
I can get behind that. So we just have time for a few more questions.
Okay, so here's another one that's come in, and that is, what are some best practices around managing a succession planning program? Mike, do you want to take that one?
I will start, certainly. The outreach and communication processes when you initiate it are really fundamental. That you need to have a clear and transparent process for meeting certain minimum qualifications for qualification to be in the program. And there's standard things like a certain amount of longevity in the organization, a certain level of overall recent performance, in the position. So it's not that it's against the rules, but it's usually a waste of time for someone who's a brand new employee in the organization, a much lower level, to be in a succession planning program for a very senior position, because they're just so far away from meeting minimum qualifications. So transparent communications is very important. A variety of assessment activities to determine qualification, which can be things similar to writing exercises. They can be panel interviews. They can be workbox exercises. Different varieties of things to determine some basic kind of starting skill sets is also part of a best practice. It's also very important as part of best practice for you to be, as Karen talked about learning and development resources earlier, you need to be capturing your internal so-called on-the-job training resources available within the organization, where sometimes there's a lot of things going on, but you don't know that there is mentoring going on in this department, and there's more stretch assignments going on here, and they're using a particular tool or template for that. So to kind of gather together to have available more widely in the organization all of the internal kind of training options and opportunities that you already have, you just don't know you have them because they haven't been spread organization-wide. So those are a couple of practices that are very, very helpful. But all training and development doesn't have to be, a formal program that a 4P provider or a university does. They do a lot of great things, but there's an awful lot of learning activities that are going on internally, and they need to be captured and kind of promulgated more widely throughout the organization.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is, what tools and processes do you suggest for preparing employees to take on new roles in the organization that interest them? Karen, you want to take that?
Sure, thanks, Julie. So Mike talked a little bit about this and some of the best practices, but there's just a variety of things to get folks ready. One is mentoring, or job sharing or job shadowing. It's so important when you have folks with these kinds of potentials, and you're looking at succession planning to give them opportunities within the organization to learn about the organization, learn about different jobs, learn about the ins and outs. So that job sharing, job rotation, shadowing, stretch assignments too. We talked about this earlier. Jeff talked about this earlier with this level of discomfort. You know, if we're always in our zone of comfort and we don't sort of step out of that proximal development, we're not going to expand. We're not going to expand our thinking. We're not going to expand what we know, what our relationships are. So those stretch assignments that ask folks to work with people in other departments, take on a task that is, or an activity or an assignment that is not right in their area, where they have to learn to work with new people, learn new things. Those are super, super important. And being on those cross-functional teams allows them to build those relationships and work with different kinds of people with different perspectives and different levels of experience and different knowledge and experience that they bring to the team.
I'd like to add a comment. Another side benefit of some of these activities, as in, you know, job shadowing and mentoring, is some percentage of folks in the succession planning program find out, I really don't want to go into leadership at a certain level. They learn it, you know, through this exercise or through these activities, which is a lot better than pursuing it fully, going into the job and being miserable for several years because this isn't where you excel. This isn't where you're excited, and then you're going to get dysfunctional and basically leave anyway. So to find out that this is not a good fit for me via a program is better than finding out on the job after a couple of crummy years.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrific, thank you. So next question is, how can a small organization with an HR department of one effectively address succession planning?
HR of one. I like that. Very noble. It is. Well, you know, it is. Yeah, HR has to take on a lot, but I would say don't take on succession planning by yourself. It shouldn't be something that's just undertaken by HR and HR just kind of runs the whole thing. You're going to have buy-in from the leadership team because you're going to need a lot of agency resources, a lot of time and other resources, you know, in order to develop people. And so you really need the cooperation of, you know, all your leadership. Really, you've got to, you know, help them understand that succession planning really is an investment in the future of the organization. So this is, you know, we hear about, you know, HR becoming, you know, part of the, you know, helping the, you know, this part of being a strategic partner in the organization. This is a perfect example of that. So bring in the senior leaders, get them on board and work together. That's the best way to do it. Again, don't take it all on yourself.
Yeah, as we've said a couple times today, that top leadership support does not just mean nice words about the program in writing or in speaking. If you ask top leaders, will you participate as a mentor? Will you participate in leading some discussions? Will you let people shadow you or involve them in different activities? If the answer is consistently no, then we probably say you don't have leadership support yet. So you need to work to achieve that before you make this major commitment.
Will you let your people take time out away from their job for these developmental opportunities?
Okay, well, I would say that we are right about at time now, so I want to thank you, Michael, Karen, and Jeff, for a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Again, we'll send an email with a link to today's recording and slide deck. Thank you so much, and have a great day.